that the shorter our attention spans are getting and the shorter, social media is getting, these details are getting lost. And one of those is US versus global. And so when we, go forward in this conversation, Tara and I will probably talk mostly in US numbers. And there are a lot of organizations or articles out there that will switch between. They'll use maybe a global statistic that supports their cause a little bit better, or, shines a worse light on agriculture. And you just can't like interchange those in the same conversation. It's like apples to oranges, right? So we'll focus on probably talking mostly like US emissions and US cattle and just kind of staying in our own territory, unless, you bring up a specific question, because there is a lot to think about globally, right? Like agriculture doesn't stop at our nation's borders. It carries across the entire globe. So not that we don't want to talk about global, we'll just kind of, I guess, address like US, emissions instead of globally. I guess just to get right into the numbers. So according to the EPA, greenhouse gas emissions from cattle are less than, agriculture as a whole is 11%, and livestock within that is less than 4%. I think it's like 3.7 maybe. Tara, do you know for sure?
Yep, it's about 3.7. It's just under 4 of total emissions in the United States.
So, very small percentage. We have transportation, industry, and electricity that make up, I think, over 80% of that. When you look at the numbers, it is vastly different than what, kind of those headlines are saying, that cattle are ruining the environment, whatever those titles may be. The numbers are pretty low when it comes to cattle's emissions.
Tara, do you have anything to add to some pervasive statistics related to that end?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that also is a part of this conversation is, while we may only be like just less than 4%, it doesn't mean that we're just like sitting back and just saying, oh, that's good enough, like we're low enough. There is a ton going into reducing cattle's and overall all of agriculture's carbon footprint. Another really fun statistic that surprised people is agriculture currently is actually a carbon sink. So Natalie mentioned that agriculture and forestry make up about 11% of total emissions, but they're actually a 12% carbon sink. So they actually already currently are in negative emissions, but we are trying to do even better to help offset some of the other emissions that are going on in our system. As Natalie said, just like agriculture goes beyond our borders, we know that greenhouse gas emissions are not like in their own little bubbles either, right? It's an entire global scale. It's what our entire nation is producing. And so by agriculture being able to offset some of the other industries, I think is a really crucial part of ag being like a key player in kind of this climate solution conversation.
So Tara brings up a really valid point too, that I think a lot of people miss in this conversation, or at least don't carry the conversation, to include, is that yes, again, like we're not denying that agriculture has a footprint. Like we fully recognize that like what we are doing, does carry methane or carbon. Like we have a footprint. But I don't think people talk about like what agriculture is doing, right? So like we're putting food on the plates for people 3 times a day. We have grocery stores full of food. It's like we have to understand. I think I just get frustrated that I'm like, we're 11%, and cattle are, again, that's total counting crops. So cattle are less than that. It's like, that's our footprint. But look at what, we're providing, right? Like food, it's a necessity. We need it. And we don't just provide that for our nation. Obviously, we have importation and exportation too. And so I get frustrated that it's like, what are we supposed to do? Feed people with zero? Like we can't, like we have to be allowed to have some sort of, output for us. And I just think that gets missed. And I also think like carrying on that note of like, I guess, positive parts of it, we also miss a lot of the conversation of like the good things ruminants can do. So like cattle grazing out at pasture actually are extremely beneficial to soil health. Tara mentioned earlier, carbon sink. Ag and forestry are the only things that can act as a carbon sink, and it's because of the soil. So the better we do at our jobs as farmers and ranchers at taking care of that soil, which grazing animals are a part of that, they're an integral part of that actually, the more we can actually pull the carbon out of the air. So there's a lot of benefits to actually having cattle on the ground too. Again, there's a trade-off. We're gonna have those outputs of carbon and methane, but we get to recycle them. They're part of like a biogenic carbon cycle. And so I just think like there's just puzzle pieces people like to put out there instead of putting them all together.
I think I could just sit back throughout this entire conversation and just let you two take the lead. This would be a fabulous conversation for me just to sit in. But I do want to ask some clarifying questions. So you talked about the 11% total contribution to the total carbon emission, and among that, about 3.7 to 4% is the actual number. Are you including both factory farming and dairy farms like you two, or what's the differences or nuances there?
Yeah, so for just under 4% is the total for all animal agriculture. So, the animal production side of agriculture. So we said 11% is all of ag. So that includes crop production, producing all of our vegetables, all of our fruit, tree nuts, all of that is that 11%. Within that 11%, 4% is all of animal ag. And that includes all different types of animal ag production. I think one thing that might surprise people is I feel like if a lot of people heard about or saw our farm, they would probably classify it as quote unquote a factory farm. And I live about 100 steps to my dairy barn, and my backyard is literally our cows' pens. I think the word factory farm gets thrown out there a lot without people fully understanding what the farms actually look like. We have a lot of tours on our farm, and it always surprises people. They go in with a ton of misconceptions and leave really with a ton, with their eyes being opened as to the fact that larger farms does not always mean bad. Big is not bad. Small is not better. There's tons of different sized farms, and it's about, the management practices that go into it and the farmers behind it. And I'll let Natalie speak on the beef side, because I think she has some really incredible numbers that share kind of what the beef side of this looks like.
Yeah. So like Tara mentioned, when it comes to, and I'm actually going to pause for a second, because I do think this is another, I don't want to say problem. I just think it's another nuance that adds a layer of complexity when we're just trying to have these normal conversations. So I do think that all the different animal proteins get lumped together. So people will interchangeably talk about the chicken industry with the pork industry, with, the beef industry, with the dairy industry, not understanding that all of them are going to be vastly different. The pork and the chicken industry are what is called vertically integrated. And for anyone who doesn't know what that means, it means that there's one owner from the beginning of the product until the very end. So that would be like a Tyson. A Tyson could own the chicks all the way from the very beginning, all the way to the very end. It is fully owned by Tyson. One thing I think a lot of people don't know about the beef industry when it comes to, red meat, steaks, hamburger, all of that, it is not vertically integrated. So it truly is a collection of families together to provide, your steak or your hamburger, whatever's in the grocery store, on your plate in the restaurant or at home. Over 90% of those are family operated. The numbers are about 700,000 in the US. So there's 700,000 families that are raising beef. The average herd size is 43. So like Tara said, I think the idea that factory farming gets thrown out a little bit more than it should, because there's 700,000 families in the US that have an average of 43 cows. And together, collectively, they're putting, again, that red meat on the table. And so I just, like Tara said, I think a root of the issue is that we did get removed from farming and ranching, right? And it would be the same, Tara and I talk about this with agriculture, but it's the same if I was to go and try and talk about electricity. I don't know what it takes to walk into my house and turn on the light switch, I have a lot of misconceptions about it. I'm just removed from it. It's a privilege we have in the, living where we do. And so I don't expect everyone to understand everything about agriculture, because you don't, right? You're living in urban cities, you're living in sprawls, you're living wherever it is that, you don't have to be out at the field anymore, or have a milk cow to, have milk, or, garden if you don't want to. And so it's not our fault that we're removed. That's just the way, we've progressed as a society. But I do think, like Tara said, if we could get back to the idea of people actually just setting foot on a farm or ranch, I think a lot of those things that we're fearful of, or things we have questions around, would really come to ease and just make a lot more sense if you could get your boots on the soil on an actual ranch or farm.
Hey Seekers, if you enjoyed watching that short clip, I strongly recommend clicking here for the full-length episode. Here's to discovering more valuable life stories with practical mental health insights. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace